This presentation is on the regulation of medications, and I'm Bethany Von Hoff, and I'll be presenting today. This presentation is going to briefly cover the regulation of medications. This is a very complicated process. We will cover a few of the various categories of medications that exist, but again, this presentation will be a survey and will not cover everything. Medications often have several names. You may be familiar with the terms generic and brand name. When a chemical compound is first identified as a drug, it's given a chemical name. This name reflects the chemistry of the drug. Then, once this compound is submitted to the FDA as a drug, it gets a generic name. The generic name also contains part of the chemical name or a shortened version of the chemical name. Then finally, the marketing team comes up with a catchy name for the medication that's easy for patients and prescribers to remember, and that's the brand name. The brand name is often the one you most commonly hear in advertisements and commercials. The legal regulation of medications has often been reactionary in the United States. Laws were often formed in response to something bad that was happening. So a long time ago, people used to be able to sell chemicals, making claims about what they were selling and what the chemicals could do. These chemicals often couldn't do what they claimed to do, and worse, some were harmful to patients or didn't even contain the chemicals they were supposed to. In response to this, in 1938, there was the Food and Drug Cosmetics Act that said that drugs on the market had to be proven that they were safe. Drugs on the market before 1938 didn't have to prove that they were safe or that they worked, and these medications are known as DESI medications, and there are still a few of them on the market today. Then in 1951, the Durham-Humphrey Amendment established two different categories of medication: prescription and over-the-counter. A little over 20 years after drugs had to be proven safe, they then had to be proven as effective in 1962. Again, drugs before 1938 were grandfathered into this amendment as well. Then in 1997, there was the FDA Modernization Act, which said that drug manufacturers could provide information about off-label drug use to healthcare professionals, but not to consumers. Again, drugs that were on the market prior to 1938 have never had to prove their safety or efficacy. Next, we'll talk about the process of drug development. It's very long and complex, so this provides just some highlights. First, in preclinical trials, drug manufacturers are trying to find compounds that have structural relationships related to the receptors or targets known to be involved in a disease. Once this chemical is isolated, it's often tested in the lab, often primarily in animal models, looking for therapeutic effects and adverse events. If the compound does well in preclinical trials, it will move on to phase 1 trials, which involve the drug being tested on healthy humans. It's usually a single-dose trial looking at the pharmacokinetics of what happens when we give this substance to a healthy adult. What can we expect? The phase 1 looks at the pathway of the drug through the body, looking for adverse events. Typically, this is a small group of 20 to 80 patients. Phase 2 often has a few hundred patients who have the condition for which the new medication is intended to treat. In phase 2, you're looking at signs of efficacy and looking for evidence of adverse events that you didn't see in the preclinical and phase 1 trials. In phase 2 trials, you may get limited information about short-term adverse events. In phase 3, again, you're testing the new drug on patients that have the condition you're intending to treat. It's a larger number than phase 2, with hundreds to thousands of patients. In phase 3, you're looking at the risk versus benefit. We already have an idea now that the drug works, but we'll want to use it in a slightly broader population and usually for a little bit longer to see if the benefit of the drug outweighs the risk of the side effects. Phase 4 clinical trial is after the drug has already been approved by the FDA and is available to the general public. We're no longer doing research on specific patients, but we're evaluating the medication's safety and efficacy when the drug is on the market after FDA approval. In phase 4, we're really seeing what's going to happen to this drug when it's given to a wide variety of patients. In phase 1, 2, and 3, we're very careful to restrict who is enrolled in the trials. Once the drug is made available to any patient for any condition, unexpected things can happen. There can be new adverse events that weren't seen before, but we also could find a new benefit of the drug. Things can be put on the market for one reason, and we can find out it works for something else too. Two examples of things that happened in the post-marketing or phase 4 were Redux, the weight loss drug, was pulled from the market within a few months of approval because of the risk of serious heart problems. And then Simitrel or amantadine, it was found that patients taking Simitrel for Parkinson's disease got fewer cases of influenza. Drugs usually take a long time to get to the market, but there are some paths for fast track. Drugs can get an accelerated review if they are treating a serious or life-threatening illness that doesn't have other options. This is determined by the FDA if a drug is qualified for an accelerated review. Also, patients who are suffering from serious or life-threatening illnesses with no other treatments and who do not meet the inclusion criteria to be included in a drug trial may still be able to use the drugs through the investigational new drug treatment. This is generally considered a side study to the clinical trial. We can't generalize this information as much as we can with the data collected in the clinical trials, since the patients are not part of a controlled population as part of the study, but it can add new information about the drugs being tested. Finally, orphan drugs are those drugs created to specifically treat a rare medical condition. In the United States, this is defined as affecting less than 200,000 people. From a business perspective, companies may not want to spend millions and millions of dollars trying to find a cure that will only be used by a small subset of the population. They cannot recoup the money they spent on research and development, and the return on investment is low. In this case, the government gives financial incentives and other incentives to develop these medications, since the normal business model does not work. Next, we'll move into some of the different types of categories of medications. The first we'll talk about is pregnancy categories. These are the guidelines we use to determine if a medication is appropriate for a woman who is pregnant or breastfeeding. You can see that the categories are rather broad and vague. This is because there often isn't great evidence because pregnant women are not included in drug trials. Often this decision comes down to weighing risk versus benefit. If a drug is in category A or B, we feel pretty comfortable using it in pregnant or breastfeeding women. If it is category X, we would never use it. The risk will always be greater than any potential benefit. We may use category D if the mother's life is at risk and if there is significant benefit for the drug. A lot of drugs fall into category C, which means we just don't know. We don't have clear evidence if it harms the woman or the baby, or we don't have evidence that it's really safe. This next slide provides a few examples of drugs in each of the pregnancy categories. Let's take a pause for self-assessment. So pause the presentation here and take a few minutes to think about these two questions. What are the differences between the 4 phases of clinical trials in the drug development process? And what does it mean for a drug to be in pregnancy category A? Think about if a friend who was pregnant said that her doctor recommended a medication that was in pregnancy category A. How would you explain that to her? If you cannot answer these questions after some time to pause, I'd encourage you to review the previous slides again. The next classification of medications we will talk about are the controlled substances. These are medications that have potential for abuse. They are ranked specifically by their risk of abuse, and these classifications are enforced by the DEA. States can be more strict than the federal government, but they cannot be less strict. One caveat to this is medical marijuana. The smoked marijuana is classified as a Schedule I medication. This means from a therapy standpoint, it is not considered to have a therapeutic benefit. However, some states do allow the use of medical marijuana, so this is in direct conflict with the FDA regulation. This is problematic, but this really is one of the only examples where states are in conflict with the DEA classification. Here are some examples of medications that fall into the different controlled substance scheduling categories, so you can get a feel of how risk of abuse is categorized by different medications. Shifting gears, it can take a lot of money to develop a drug, and there's a lot of risk involved. To alleviate some of this risk and to allow companies to recoup the cost of research and development, they can patent drugs, and this allows for market exclusivity so they can recoup the financial investment back. The patent is 20 years, but it begins the minute the chemical has been isolated and submitted to the FDA. even though the medication may not make it to market ever, or it may be 10 years or so until it makes it to market. The drug company can extend the patent and try to maintain market exclusivity for as long as they can. Sometimes they'll do things such as add an extended release form or change the formulation to extend the patent. Once a patent runs out, it's allowable for other manufacturers to put the medication on the market in a generic form. Generic medications are usually significantly less expensive, but not because they are of lesser quality, but because they did not have to spend the money on marketing and development. Generic medications are equivalent to brand medications. Generic medications are held to the same good manufacturing practices as the brand medication. Generic medications have to have the identical active ingredient and have to have the same purity, quality, and strength as the brand name medication. Studies are done to ensure that the drugs are bioequivalent, which means that they dissolve and absorb and pass through the body in the same way as the brand medication, so you can be assured that the drug's concentration and the body exposure are similar. There's rigorous process behind generic medication manufacturing. OTC drugs, or over-the-counter drugs, are also called non-prescription or self-care drugs. These may include things like antihistamines and antacids. A lot of OTC drugs used to be prescription drugs in the past, and in the past decade or so have switched to over-the-counter. However, just because a medication is available without a prescription does not mean that it is without risk. In general, people in the United States are pretty casual when it comes to taking medications, and they can be really casual about taking over-the-counter medications, even though these medications can have serious or even fatal side effects. They also can have significant drug-drug interactions as well. For example, patients with uncontrolled high blood pressure who take certain cold medications are at an increased risk for strokes. You should always ask a pharmacist if you're in question whether an over-the-counter medication is safe to take or not. The pharmacist is free and easily available for you to answer these questions. There is an in-between class of medications that's often called behind-the-counter medications. They are technically over-the-counter medications because they do not require a prescription, yet because of safety or other reasons they are kept behind the counter, so the pharmacist has a little bit more monitoring or documentation of the sales. This includes things like pseudoephedrine, Plan B, and tobacco. There's been a lot of confusion about dietary supplements, including what they are and how they're regulated, and they have a pretty interesting history. Before 1994, they were either regulated as food or as drugs. It kind of depended on how they were intended to be used. For example, if they were intended to be used more like a nutritional supplement or a pharmaceutical agent. And depending on whether something is classified as a food or a drug, that affects how it's regulated and monitored. Then, after 1994, the DSHEA, or the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, was passed. This created a new category for dietary supplements that was neither food nor drug. They are allowed to say that they can affect certain structure-function components in the body, but they cannot make claims to treat, prevent, cure, or diagnose diseases. Dietary supplements are no longer allowed to be represented as food, but this still gets into a little bit of a gray area with things that are added to foods and juices to enhance or supplement the food. Because dietary supplements are in their own category, they are not regulated by the FDA and do not have to be FDA approved. They do not have to prove safety or efficacy before entering in the market. And the manufacturers of dietary supplements are not required to track or monitor adverse events the same way that drug manufacturers do. So the FDA can't really go after manufacturers of dietary supplements until there have been multiple adverse events or overwhelming evidence that something is going on. Finally, in 2007, legislation was passed that required dietary supplement manufacturers to be held to good manufacturing practices. This means that they have to demonstrate that what is in the tablet matches what's on the label. This includes the identity, purity, quality, composition, and strength. This legislation was phased in over 3 years and is fully phased in now. However, with the limited resources at the FDA and the multitude of dietary supplements, there are likely still products on the market that do not meet these regulations. Going back to safety, manufacturers of prescription drugs must report all adverse effects brought to their attention to the FDA. So you have to rigorously track these adverse events and report them to the FDA. This is not required by manufacturers of dietary supplements. So to review, there are different phases of the drug development process, preclinical through phase 4. There are different pregnancy categories depending on the risk versus benefit of using the medication in a pregnant or breastfeeding patient. Also, after this presentation, you should be able to classify other categories of medications, including generic medications, orphan drugs, over the counters, behind the counter medications, tobacco, and dietary supplements.